Now, if you've been watching this channel for a few years, you probably think that I don't do that much black and white photography, but I actually do really enjoy black and white photography. And over the years, I've actually shot quite a lot of what I think are pretty strong images that were not necessarily intentionally black and white images, but actually ended up looking better as black and white shots. So this video is all about the things that I've learned over the years when it comes to successfully being able to capture a black and white image. And instead of taking you to some exotic, far-flung location, I've decided to just set up camp right outside my house and shoot birds and squirrels over on my wood pile.
A big thanks goes out to Luminar Neo for sponsoring this video.
Now, before we get into the sort of artistic and creative aspects of black and white photography and the things that I've learned over the years, let's first address just one very simple but very important technical aspect of it, and that is how to set up your camera to get the best results for black and white landscape photography photos. And I will say, even though all of this is geared towards landscape photography, it really doesn't matter what kind of photography you do. The tips that I'm going to give you in this video should apply to pretty much any kind of photography when it comes to black and white. Now, I'm not going to say that there's a right or a wrong way to do this. I'm just telling you the way that I do it. And I much prefer to shoot my black and white images as color images. I'll shoot a color raw file and then I'll convert it to black and white in post. And I'll show you the reasons why I much prefer to shoot it as a color image first. But one thing that I do like to do on my camera, because I can do it, is to preview the image in black and white. So I'll show you how I set that up on the Sony, and if your camera does a similar thing, whichever system you're on. I know that Fujifilm does offer this as well, and I think maybe Canon does. It's a really powerful way to visualize whether or not your composition is actually going to work in black and white. Let me show you this.
I simply assign a custom button, in this case C2, to the camera's creative look color profiles, and once that's open, I just set it to black and white. Now I can preview my composition in black and white to see if it's gonna work. I can quickly set it back to my standard color profile, as it just takes 1 second to do. Most camera manufacturers have a similar function. You've just got to figure out how to assign it to a custom function button like I did, so that you don't have to go digging in the menus. Now, I should mention that as long as you're shooting a RAW file, your camera should retain all of the color data, even if you actually shoot the image in black and white mode and playback shows as black and white. Now, that might not be the case for JPEGs, so just remember to consult your camera manual.
Well, it doesn't look like my little friendly squirrel is going to show up. So far, all I've seen is cute little birds. They're cute, but the squirrel's a lot cuter. He's a right character. All right, so let's just get into some of the creative and artistic aspects of how to get good results with black and white photography. And the first question I would always ask myself when I'm looking specifically for a strong black and white image is color really very important to this composition? If you're trying to capture like an autumn scene or a spring scene and it's a seasonal, colourful shot, then it might work as a black and white, but typically if you're drawn to the colour of a scene and you're composing your scene around that beautiful, important colour, the chances are it probably won't work that well as a black and white image.
So this image that I shot near Banff National Park obviously is all about colour, and when I go black and white, even with some contrast adjustments, you can see that it just loses all of its impact, because that colour that makes the composition is now gone in the black and white. So in this case, that definitely does not work.
Now, there's always images that are exceptions to the rule, and I've even had some success converting autumn images into black and white images, but they tend to work more because of the shapes and the forms and the dramatic contrasty light. You don't really lose that much by losing the colour of the autumn image if it's already strong in other areas, such as the contrast, the mood and the forms. Oh, come on, Mr. Squirrel, where is he? I don't know what he's doing. I mean, what does a squirrel do at 3 o'clock in the afternoon? Right, now before we continue with the sort of creative and artistic aspects of black and white photography, let me first show you how I do my conversions and explain to you the reasons why I prefer to shoot in colour and then convert that image that's already a strong image into an even stronger looking black and white image.
Okay, so I've got my color image loaded up into Luminar Neo, and the first thing I'm going to do is just go down here to my tools and go to black and white, and I'm just going to hit convert to black and white. And really all that it's done, if I go into the saturation here, if you look at all of these sliders for each color, they're all the way down to absolutely nothing. But what's important here is if I go to luminance, these sliders are at 0, meaning that there's still some play in the colors, even though each color has been completely desaturated. So watch what happens. Look at the image when I crank this yellow slider over to the right, and if I pull it down to the left, you'll see it has a very dramatic effect on the image, because if I switch this off, obviously there's a lot of yellow in the image. That lovely warm sunlight is blasting through those clouds and hitting that mountain. So I can affect the black and white by playing with the luminance of some of these color sliders. And in this case, I find it really enhances the image quite a lot, really sort of accentuates those bright hot spots if I crank those yellows all the way to the right. And then if I get this blue slider and I pull that all the way down to the left, look at these corner areas, these shadow areas in the sky. So this is where we started off. Obviously there's blue there in that sky. If I bring the luminance of that blue down, it just makes that sky a little bit more moody looking. Now, one thing that I love to do with my black and white images, especially an image like this, is it's all about contrast. So I want to tweak the contrast in selective areas of this image to accentuate lovely rays of light like this and all of that texture in the cloud. And I do that with the develop tool here in Luminar. So let's just go into this develop tool, and there's a few ways I can do this. I could crank the contrast, smart contrast like that, and then mask it in. But I think what I'll do is I'll just play with a very basic curve. So I'll start with this shadow point here, and I'll pull that to the right. Now, basically, when I'm cranking that slider down there, I'm just looking at what's going on in the sky. I want to accentuate that lovely contrast, and then I'm just going to pop that highlight point there and just make that a little bit over the top. Now that's too much on the entire image, so I'm just going to mask this in. So I'm going to go to masking, brush, and then I'm going to paint, and I'll get a large brush, right bracket key, and I'm just going to brush this area here to create that contrast just up here in the sky. So let's just see what that looks like. So if I switch that off, that is the contrast change that I've made, and I really like that. And I think I might just do a little bit more in the foreground as well. This time I'll get a smaller brush and I'll just do that there, and that looks, maybe that bit there, that looks really tasty to me. So that's what I've got now. And one thing I could do is exaggerate this beam of light. So what you can do with Luminar Neo is you can add multiple develop edits to your image. So you just click on that to close that down, and then click on it again to create a new one. So if you look down here at the curve, it's reset, right? We've still got that one that I just did, but this is a new one. So in this case, all I want to do is pop the highlight. So I'm just going to click at this point in the curve and make things just a little bit brighter. In fact, I might just pull the shadows down a smidge, just to something like that. Now again, that's on the entire image. It's way too much, but I just want to brush it into this ray of light here. So I'm going to go back up to masking, brush, paint, and probably with a smaller brush than that, because I want it to be just about the thickness of the beam. I'll just brush that in there, and it kind of splashes out a little bit there. And let's just see how that looks. So if I switch that off, that's without my ray of light accentuation, and that's with it on. And if you feel like you've overdone it, then just basically go back to the curve and make it a bit more subtle. Just tone that down ever so slightly. Let's go back up, switch that off, and then on, off, and then on. And this is pretty much all that I do once I've converted my image to black and white. So I convert it to black and white. I'll play with the color luminance just to see if that enhances certain elements of the image. And then after that, it's all about selective contrast using develop and the masking tools built into Luminar Neo.
Okay, so now this next tip is probably the most useful, and that is to look for very contrasty dynamic light in your landscapes. You'll never find a more dramatic and impressive looking light in a landscape than during a storm. When you get those bright hotspots of light that cut through dark and doomy clouds, you're just going to get absolutely beautiful contrast and beautiful dynamics. And even though your image will quite obviously work brilliantly as a color image, it's almost guaranteed that when you get light like that and you can compose your shot well, you'll get an absolutely fantastic black and white image. And often in those cases, the light itself will dictate how you compose the shot. Now, quite often, I will look at my compositions in terms of the abstract shapes and forms. It's not necessarily a case of looking at the light. Sometimes it's not even a case of looking at the story or even the journey. And you know me, I like to do those journey shots. But often when it comes to my compositions, and especially with black and white, I'm just looking at the shapes of things. How do my shapes interact with one another? What are the curves? What are the lines that make up these forms and graphic shapes in my compositions? I'm not necessarily looking at them in terms of their context. I kind of visualize them and look at them out of context. And when you have very pleasing shapes, that's really going to help you with your black and white photography compositions. Well, I don't think this squirrel's going to show up. This is a rip-off. And I'm getting all soggy and wet here in this slushy snow, so let's go back up to the office and finish this video up there. And I might have a nice cup of coffee and maybe a piece of chocolate. Glass of Baileys. Oh, that's better. Nice and warm in here. Now it's time for me to completely contradict what I said earlier. Remember when I was talking about stormy, contrasty light? Well, you still can get really beautiful, low contrast black and white images anytime that you get atmospherics, mist or fog or low-lying cloud. That's when you've got the potential for a really beautiful, low contrast black and white image. Let me show you how I process that type of shot here. All right, so I've got my color image in Luminar Neo, and as you can see, it's that beautiful tree at Fairy Lake. Very, very atmospheric morning. And when I shot this image, I didn't even need to do the black and white preview. It almost is a colorless scene. So I knew, even at the time, that this would work really well as a black and white. So let's just do what we did earlier. We'll go to black and white, convert to black and white. In this case, I'm not going to do any of these luminance sliders for the separate colors because I've already tried that. I know that it doesn't really make any difference, but let's go into our develop module. And as I said, this is pretty much where most of the magic happens for me in Luminar Neo. So looking at this image, you can see straight away that it's already pretty low contrast, but what I would do is just brighten this up ever so slightly, keeping an eye on that histogram there. You can see it's starting to get a little bit upset about how bright things are, but I'll pull down the highlights just a little bit, and that is bringing in some of those shadow areas, but I do not want to make them any darker. I could pull that shadow slider down and emphasize that background, but what I like about this image is the low contrast. In fact, I might even just pull that shadow slider up ever so slightly to soften the contrast a little bit, because it's such a simple composition that I don't really need to manipulate it that much. The simplicity of the composition speaks for itself, and in this case, I feel like it works great as a low contrast image. So let's just look at the before, that's the color image. Let's look at the after, and then let's also look at the complete lack of contrast change. So that's when it was more contrasty, and this is after I've lifted those shadows and pulled the highlights down to make it even less contrasty. And I think in this case, that low contrast approach really works. Let me show you another image. Okay, so I've got this beautiful foggy morning from the island of Fogo. Let's launch this into the edit window. So what I like about this image is the depth, right? If you look at this foreground, this is much closer to us, obviously, it's foreground. And you can see that there is more contrast, there's more darkness to the shadows. But as the scene goes away from us into the distance, you can see that that contrast becomes softer. The shadows are not as dark. So there's two ways I could do this to balance things out. I could either increase the contrast of the background to bring it closer to the camera, or I could decrease the contrast of the foreground here to kind of push that back towards this misty background. And in this case, I feel that that's what this image needs. So as before, I'm just going to go to black and white and convert to black and white. And in this case, there is a little bit of color, so I'll just play with these luminance sliders a little bit. I know that just in this area here, there's a bit of yellow with, I think it's kelp. If I just push that up, you'll see just a subtle difference in the foreground there, and I like that. And there's quite a lot of blue in this image, so if I switch that off, you can see there's quite a lot of blue. So if I push this blue slider over to the right and just brighten things up a little bit, it just sort of emphasizes that foggy feeling, but I've got to pay attention to this histogram so that it doesn't get blown out. But I think that that's pretty good. So let's switch that off. That's the color, and this is the black and white conversion. And it's still really atmospheric. But what I want to do is reduce these shadows in this foreground to push them a bit further into that misty background. So you've guessed it, I'm just going to go to my develop module. I'm going to push my shadow slider all the way up to the right. I might even pull the highlights down just a little bit, just to make it slightly duller in the foreground. But of course, that is on the entire image. I only want it in that foreground. So I'm going to go to masking, brush, paint, and slightly smaller brush than that. And I'm just going to carefully brush that in. Well, not even that carefully, to be honest. It's a pretty easy process because the image is so soft. So let's just see how that looks. And we'll switch that off and then on, off and then on. I don't know about you, but for me, that less contrasty foreground definitely makes the foreground blend better with that distant, fogged out background. And in a case like this, with a scene like this, I feel like that low contrast approach really works instead of the high contrast approach that you saw in those earlier images. Well, I hope you enjoyed this video. Hope you learned a few things there. If you did enjoy it, please give it the old thumbs up. Subscribe to the channel, don't forget to tickle my bell. And before I disappear, I just want to say a huge thank you to all of these Patreon supporters that help me to keep this channel going. And if you wanted to join my monthly critique sessions, I've put a link to my Patreon in the description down below. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.